Ever find yourself like curious about the real Jesus? You know, not just the stained glass window version, but the actual person who like walked the earth 2,000 years ago.
Hmm.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going way beyond those familiar Bible stories. We're going to be looking at like archaeology and history,
Yeah.
and using some work from the Biblical Archaeology Society to see what they've uncovered. And you know what?
Wow.
We might even end up like challenging some of our own assumptions along the way, you know, about who Jesus was and all that.
Well, that's what the Biblical Archaeology Society is known for. It's taking this really balanced approach. They examine the textual evidence, but they also really dig into what's been found, like physically, through archaeology.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it really gives us a much richer picture than just relying on, the Bible alone.
Absolutely. So we're not just talking about faith here. We're talking about like actual evidence. And that evidence can lead to some pretty surprising things. For example, did you know there's actually like debate about whether Jesus was even born in Bethlehem?
Hmm.
And what about Nazareth? I mean, was it really this like tiny little insignificant village?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. There's this scholar, Philip J. King, with the Biblical Archaeology Society, and he's done a lot of work on the significance of both Bethlehem and Nazareth in Jesus' life.
Okay.
And what his work is suggesting is that maybe we've oversimplified things a bit. Even the Bible, gives us these conflicting accounts and descriptions of these places, which, makes us question those traditional narratives.
So the Christmas story, the one we all grew up with, might not be the whole picture. That's kind of wild when you think about it. I mean, it makes you wonder what else we might have gotten, wrong over the centuries. Okay, so before we go too far down that road, let's back up for a second. I mean, can we even say for sure that Jesus even, existed outside of the Bible? Like, that's kind of the foundation for everything we're talking about.
It's a fundamental question for sure. And Lawrence Mikitiuk, he actually tackles this head on in his research for the Biblical Archaeology Society.
Yeah.
He goes beyond the Bible and looks at these non-biblical sources, like writings from Roman historians and Jewish writers who were around, in the first few centuries AD.
Wow.
And even though, these accounts are pretty brief, they do give us these little glimpses into this world that was trying to figure out who this Jesus guy was and what his movement was all about.
So like little clues sprinkled throughout history.
Exactly.
That kind of add up to a pretty compelling case that he was real. Pretty amazing when you think about it. Okay, but let's go back to that question about Jesus's birthplace and home for a sec. If Bethlehem might not be the whole story, what about Nazareth? What's the evidence tell us there?
Well, there's this archaeologist, Ken Dark, and he's been doing some excavations in Nazareth. He's been working on this first century house that some people think might have been, get this, Jesus' childhood home.
No way.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that this house, it was actually revered during the Byzantine era. So, that suggests a really early connection to Jesus.
Wow. Can you imagine like uncovering the place where Jesus might have grown up? That would be unbelievable. But here's something that I found really surprising. The archaeological evidence is suggesting that Nazareth wasn't this like tiny little village, that it was actually more prosperous than we think.
Right. That's a pretty common misconception. Ken Dark's research shows that Nazareth was actually, more well off than we previously thought. Which means that maybe, just maybe, Jesus didn't come from these like super humble beginnings. Like maybe he had access to more resources and education than we, typically think.
Yeah. I always pictured it as this tiny, insignificant village,
It definitely paints a different picture.
It does. It does. And it makes you wonder how that might shaped like his worldview and his teachings, But speaking of challenging assumptions, let's get to the question. Like, everyone wants to know, did Jesus marry? I mean, even, modern movies and novels, they love pairing him up with Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, it's a question that really captures people's imagination, for sure. And Birger A. Pearson, he's another scholar with the Biblical Archaeology Society, and he's done some analysis of Jesus' own words and teachings. And he's making the argument that, Jesus' main focus was on his ministry, like marriage wasn't really a priority for him.
I don't hear that perspective very often, but when you think about it, like the context of his life, his mission, it does make sense. Okay, so we've talked about whether Jesus existed, the significance of Bethlehem and Nazareth, and, the whole marriage question. But there's another topic I find super intriguing, and that's the Last Supper. I mean, was it actually a Passover Seder? Or is there something more to the story?
Oh, that's a great question. And it actually brings up some inconsistencies in the biblical accounts. So in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper, it seems like it's linked to Passover.
Okay.
So that would suggest it was a Seder.
Mm.
But then when we get to John, it gives us this whole different timeline, one that doesn't quite fit with Passover.
So we've got these different accounts. What are we supposed to make of that? Did some of the gospel writers just like get it wrong?
Well, that's where Jonathan Clonland's work comes in. He suggests we maybe think about these discrepancies not as like factual errors, but more about different theological perspectives, or even like different interpretations of what happened.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So like each gospel writer, they might be emphasizing different things, right? Or giving us a unique lens to view the Last Supper through.
So instead of getting all caught up in like who's right or wrong,
Right.
we can kind of look at these different accounts as pieces of a bigger puzzle, each one adding to our understanding of what actually happened.
Exactly. It's like having, multiple witnesses to the same event. They each have their own perspective.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what makes studying the Bible so fascinating. I mean, it's not just this book of like straight answers, It's a collection of texts that want us to like grapple with the complexity of it all, consider different viewpoints, and really just like engage in these thoughtful discussions. It struck me as we're talking about all of this, how much we just like take for granted about Jesus' life. Every time we turn a corner, it seems like there's another like assumption being challenged or another layer being peeled back. What's your biggest takeaway from all of this digging into the historical Jesus?
I think for me, it's realizing that the historical Jesus, he really is like an enigma.
Yeah.
We can piece together bits and pieces, right? Like certain parts of his life and times from archaeology and historical analysis, even those non-biblical sources we talked about. But there's still so many unanswered questions, so many mysteries.
And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay that way. But, the search itself, that's valuable.
Well,
The willingness to keep exploring and keep learning, to question things and challenge our assumptions. That's what keeps things interesting.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history isn't just something, that happened in the past. It's still alive. It's breathing. It shapes us. It influences us. Speaking of which, we've been talking a lot about the Biblical Archaeology Society and their work. Can you tell our listener a bit more about them and the resources they have?
Absolutely. The Biblical Archaeology Society, they're a non-sectarian, non-profit organization, and they're all about promoting a better understanding of the Bible and the ancient world through archaeology and historical research. And they actually published this amazing magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review, full of in-depth articles and insights.
They've also got a great website. It's packed with resources, online lectures. You can take virtual tours of archaeological sites and even like get info about educational trips they put together.
Wait, they do trips? Okay, you've officially added something to my bucket list. Imagine walking in the footsteps of history, seeing the places where Jesus lived and taught, I mean.
It's an incredible experience. And it's not just about seeing, the physical locations. The Biblical Archaeology Society, they really try to help you understand the context.
Yeah.
Right? The cultural, social, political stuff. You learn about the people, their beliefs, their motivations. It really brings that whole era to life.
So it's not just about rocks and ruins.
No, not at all.
It's about understanding, the lives of these real people who lived thousands of years ago. It's about taking all those pieces and creating a more like nuanced picture of the past. And I think that's what's so captivating about this whole deep dive into the historical Jesus. We're not just learning facts, we're trying to understand a person, a life, a legacy. And that legacy, I mean, it continues to resonate with us, even today.
Exactly. And I think that's something our listeners can really appreciate. It's about connecting with the past, right? But in a way that informs our present and inspires our future. It's about like understanding the roots of our own, beliefs and values and how those things have evolved over time.
Speaking of which, I have a question for our listener, something to really think about as we start to wrap up this deep dive. If the historical Jesus, if he was alive today, what's one question you would ask him? What's that one thing you'd want to understand better based on what we talked about today?
That's a powerful question, isn't it? It makes you think about what really matters.
Yeah.
Like what's at the heart of Jesus's message, and how does that apply to our lives right now?
It does, and I think it really speaks to the relevance of the historical Jesus. He continues to fascinate us, challenge us, inspire us, even after all these centuries.
Okay, before we get too philosophical here, we need to circle back to the Last Supper.
Yes. We were just starting to get into those discrepancies between the gospel accounts, weren't we?
We were, yeah.
Right. So the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they kind of tie the Last Supper to Passover, but then John gives us a different timeline. What's the significance of that?
Well, some scholars, they think John might have intentionally, like, shifted the timing of the Last Supper to make a specific point theologically.
Okay.
He might have wanted to emphasize Jesus, as the sacrificial lamb, and by separating the Last Supper from Passover, it creates this powerful image of Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice, offered up even before the Passover lambs were.
That's really interesting. So we're not just talking about a historical event, right? We're talking about like layers of theological interpretation that get added on, over time. I mean, it makes you realize how much our understanding of these events is shaped by, the people who wrote about them even centuries ago.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is always being interpreted and reinterpreted, especially when we're talking about, texts like the Gospels. So complex, multi-layered.
It makes you wonder, like, what other assumptions we might be making without even realizing it. It's like we need to keep asking questions, keep digging, to really get to the truth of the matter.
I think that's a great takeaway from all this. This whole deep dive into the historical Jesus. It's a journey. It's about looking at the evidence, wrestling with the complexities, and just being open to new perspectives. And like we've seen, even something like the Last Supper, which seems so straightforward.
Right.
It's got all these layers of meaning and interpretation.
I know I've learned a lot today. I hope our listeners have too. We've covered so much. I mean, from whether Jesus actually existed to those conflicting accounts of the Last Supper, and so much in between, like the significance of Bethlehem and Nazareth in his life, the possibility that he came from, more well-off beginnings than we might think, the whole debate about whether he was married. It's been quite the deep dive.
It really has. And it shows just how fascinated we still are with the historical Jesus, right? I mean, he captures our imagination, He makes us curious. He challenges us.
Yeah, he does. So as we wrap up here, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked about challenging assumptions, being open to new ideas, but here's something to really think about. What if you could strip away all the layers, all those interpretations, the theological debates, the centuries of tradition that have built up around Jesus? What would be left? What's the essence of his message? The core of what he taught that people, they still connect with even today. I think that's something we should all, keep in mind as we go on our own journeys of exploration and discovery.
Beautifully said. Yeah. It's about looking beyond the surface, beyond those familiar stories, and finding the truths that really speak to us, no matter who we are or when we lived.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to say goodbye. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the historical Jesus. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep the spirit of discovery alive. I